Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you might be watching us from. My name is Christopher Preble. I am a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center and director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here in person, as well as those watching online. My responsibilities here are very minimal. My job is mostly to introduce our co-sponsor, Princeton School of Public International Affairs. This is Dean Amani Jamal. Dr. Jamal, thank you so much for joining us virtually. Of course, we would love to have you here in person, but we're so grateful to you and to Princeton for co-sponsoring this project with us. This project here at Stimson, we're calling it A New Era in Space. And in addition to this conference today, we have initiated a essay series with the same title that talks about some of the issues that we're going to talk about in the conference today. But that essay series will remain up there on online, and we'll roll in additional essays over time. So with that, I want to turn the proceedings over to Dr. Jamal. Thank you again so much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, all. I am Amani Jamal, the Dean of the School of Public International Affairs at Princeton University. Welcome to all of you, whether you are attending in person or joining us virtually. I am pleased that Princeton and Stimson are partnering on this conference addressing the new era in space. The new space age offers both promise and perils. Space has already transformed our daily lives, from navigation to climate change, public health, smart agriculture, and food security, from education and internet access for all to monitoring the oceans, mountains, glaciers, and forests. Space has become more essential than ever for life on Earth. The space economy is thus an integral part of the future economy. The proliferation of the new space actors, smaller and cheaper satellites, and decreasing launch costs have made space more accessible to a wider range of countries and private companies. Space exploration has the potential to create new economic opportunities and scientific discoveries. But without the responsible use and management of the space domain, that promise is still in question. There are many challenges in space. I am sure you all heard about the 3 C's: contested, congested, and competitive. A new era of great power competition and tension has reached space. This tension is limiting cooperation there. Space is congested. There are thousands of satellites in the low Earth orbit and few rules for coordination and synchronization. The risk of accidents and collisions is becoming very high in the absence of a system of coordination and rules of responsible behavior in space. Outer space is also polluted, even contaminated. Space debris and space remnants, if you may, on the moon and in orbit are a threat to space, to the moon, to humans in space, and to Earth. All of this is happening in an environment in which trust and communication are lacking among the great powers, especially the spacefaring powers. Space governance is weak. There are no rules for the road to the new space, and the Outer Space Treaty is outdated. Today's panels will examine these issues through the lenses of the democratization of space and the future of space governance. Both Princeton and the Stimson Center are home to scholars who care deeply about these issues that we are going to discuss today. They are indeed among the best experts on these topics. With today's event, we aim to provide a forum for the exchange of diverse viewpoints and the promotion of innovative solutions to these challenges. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Ms. Izumi Nakamisu, Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs to the United Nations since May of 2017. Ms. Nakamisu has held several other posts at the UN, including as Assistant Administrative of the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Program. She also served as Director of the Asia and Middle East Division of the United National Department of Peacekeeping Operations and Director of the Department's Division of Policy Evaluation and Training from 2008 to 2012. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Izumi Nakamisu and enjoy today's event. Thank you all. Please join me in applause.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Jamal. It's very nice to meet you, even though through the screen. It's a real honor for me to be able to speak this morning. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity. I think you, actually, Dr. Jamal, you really started this conversation with the 3 C's, really in a very articulate way summarize the current situation. I think the topic of this event is really, really timely. The reason is that, as you say, there is an urgent need to further develop the regime governing the use and exploration of outer space. That urgency is a really acute one, and we feel that on a daily basis. This urgency is also driven by some current trends, and that's where I want to start my remarks with. So let me just briefly talk about those trends from 2 key perspectives. The first key trend is that we need to understand how private sector has become fundamentally important actors in outer space. And that's a new trend that we need to really understand also at the United Nations, which is an intergovernmental entity, as you know. The number of objects launched into outer space has increased exponentially over the past decades. And private sector actually is largely driving this increase in the use of outer space, especially through the growing deployments of large constellations in low Earth orbit. Just to give you an example, in 2010, there were approximately 2,000 functional satellites in Earth orbit. Today, there are more than 4,000, and the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, which is based in Vienna, projects there might be 70,000 by 2050. But this is actually a low estimate. While largely driven by speculation, I have to say, states have registered more than 1.7 million satellites with the International Telecommunications Union to be launched by 2030. So that really shows how the first C, congestion, is really increasing in outer space. The private sector is also driving innovation as well, including in the areas of on-orbit servicing, refueling and manufacturing, active debris removal and resource extraction and also return. The technologies underpinning these developments are also driving new military and other security-related activities in outer space. That's where I actually work in as a chief for disarmament affairs at the United Nations. Now, these include satellite inspectors that perform uncoordinated close approaches with satellites operated by others, as well as the demonstration of capabilities with possible applications as anti-satellite weapons. Possible applications. In the absence of agreed norms, rules, and effective measures, a number of these technological developments can be a source of mistrust and misperception, leading to an arms race in relation to outer space. So there is that issue of security dimension as well. In the absence of those norms is the key words, and that's why, as Dr. Jamal already mentioned, strengthening of governance framework is necessary. Now, the second trend I want to mention is much more straightforward security issue that I deal with. Now, we all know that we are in an era of increasing geopolitical tension. My God, I feel it every day at the United Nations. You feel it every day through news stories. And there is an increasing likelihood of armed conflict extending into outer space, or that an armed conflict will be initiated in outer space. Now, in breakfast discussions, it was pointed out that perhaps it is already a reality that arms conflict is starting to really extend into that new domain of outer space. The growing potential for armed conflict in relation to outer space is driven by various factors, such as increasing reliance by militaries on space-based systems, not just for early warning, but for communications, command and control, of course, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and for targeting, increasingly. A complicating factor here is that many of those capabilities are enabled by space-based assets that provide services simultaneously to the military and to civilians, dual purpose. These include essential civilian services such as Earth observation and weather monitoring, telephone, of course, internet, and positioning, timing, and navigation, all of those very much reliant on space capacities. Also, let's not forget, it's a very important fact, about 40% of the targets underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals leverage Earth observation and global navigation satellite systems. So it is also very important for Sustainable Development Goals as well. Now, the lack of constraints on development, deployment, and use of counter-space systems is also a factor, leading more militaries to seek means to ensure self-defense in outer space. Policies that envisage outer space as a war-fighting domain, God forbid, are emblematic in this regard. Perhaps a few specific concerns I want to put here as an example. Of particular concern, different means and methods of attacking satellites can result in large amount of long-lived space debris. The targeting and destruction of space-based satellites with ground-launched missiles is especially concerning. Now, tests carried out by several states over the past decades have demonstrated that strikes against satellites using ground-based missiles can have catastrophic impact on the outer space environment, generating debris that can pose a threat to humans in space and critical space-based infrastructures for decades or even longer, generations. On Earth, the growing proliferation of missile defense systems are giving more countries a de facto anti-satellite missile capability. Now, the second particular concern, perhaps, is the terrestrial components of space systems, including satellite internet terminals, are increasingly vulnerable to attacks by states and non-state actors with a variety of means. For example, cyber means, electromagnetic interference, and with conventional weapons as well. Attacks against the ground-based segments of space systems can similarly lead to severe or unknown consequences, unpredictable consequences as well. Now, finally, in this area, a broader strategic risk, if you will, may come from the inability of major spacefaring countries to overcome their geopolitical differences, tensions, and to cooperate on developing common norms that should govern future space activities. We see, for example, competing international efforts to seek a long-term human presence on the moon, each with their own understandings of what principles should guide these activities. We were touching on that during our breakfast conversations. The failure to develop common governance arrangements could lead to the contested and fragmented regimes relating to outer space activities, which could become a source of future conflict also, and potential escalation as well. So what should we do about it, all these challenges? And what are the current international intergovernmental efforts, especially at the United Nations? In the area of international security, contemporary geopolitical divisions have manifested, unfortunately, in a largely artificial divide, and we can come back to this issue, artificial divide between those who seek to focus on responsible state behavior and those who prefer a more traditional focus on capabilities through legally binding means. The proponents of both sides raise legitimate concerns over aspects and terms of proposals put forward under either approach. Those concerns can only be resolved through an inclusive dialogue, and in which both sides engage, I emphasize, engage in good faith. And I said artificial divide because at a technical level, it's interesting to see, it is already apparent that these two supposedly contending approaches, competing approaches, will likely converge on the single set of measures which can only be effective if they address all significant concerns and threats involving space systems and the use of outer space. Now, there have been considerable overlap in the proposals put forward under each proposal, each approaches, as possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, which has been considered in the Open-Ended Working Group, OEWG, and as possible elements of a legally binding instrument, which has been considered to date in the form of a GGE, Group of Governmental Experts. There's a new iteration of the GGE starting also in November this year. Now, these overlaps have included measures in areas such as, and I list just the several of them, damage and destruction of space objects or use of space objects as weapons, development and deployment of space objects for hostile purposes, interference with normal and safe operations of space objects, protection of critical space-based services, military space policies, doctrines, and strategies, very important, measures to facilitate the implementation of international obligations and commitments, obviously, notifications of defense and security exercises, and consultative mechanisms, what kind, how. The various approaches that have been proposed for preserving outer space as a realm of peace should thus be seen as complementary and mutually reinforcing. This complementarity is the essential logic that underlies the recommendation of the Secretary General in his policy brief, who has called for member states through UN disarmament bodies to develop, with the widest possible acceptance, international norms, rules, and principles to address threats to space systems, and on that basis, I emphasize, on that basis, launch negotiations on a treaty to ensure peace, security, and prevention of an arms race in outer space in the future. So, two key elements here. The goal of preventing an arms race in outer space can be best achieved through a comprehensive intergovernmental process that allows for full exploration of both of all these, or both or either of those approaches. This should also be based on the common understanding that voluntary political measures can form the basis for consideration of concepts and proposals for a future legally binding obligations. The second is that while governments must lead the development of measures to govern outer space, non-governmental actors, entities, including private sector, are playing an increasing role in this domain, as I mentioned. That means they can play a supporting role, very critical supporting role, in seeking and implementing new governance arrangements. So even though the UN is an intergovernmental outfit, we, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, is committed very much to continue to support efforts to facilitate the participation of commercial actors, civil society representatives, and other relevant actors, non-governmental, in the work of outer space-related intergovernmental processes. So this is definitely a very strong commitment that I would like to reiterate. Now, just to conclude, the expanded use of outer space could bring definitely a huge amount of benefits to all humanity, and at the same time, the enormity of the challenges, if unchecked, unaddressed, could imperil access and use of outer space for generations to come. And these are the reasons why the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has been speaking often about the need to step up space diplomacy, if you will, working together to find a path forward and to make a breakthrough in space governance. And that is why the outer space was prominently featured in his Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda, and why a policy brief which was issued at the end of May was specifically dedicated to this issue of outer space. Now, as recommended by the Secretary General, the General Assembly has decided to convene a Summit of the Future in September next year, a little less than 1 year from now. This summit will be, in our view, a major opportunity to seek at the highest political level, it's a summit, a common vision for future governance across many sectors. And we expect outer space to feature prominently in the process leading up to the summit and to be reflected in its intergovernmental negotiated outcome document, which will be called Pact of the Future. Now, the Pact of the Future is everything related to the future, everything from international financial architecture, new agenda for peace, global digital compact, but I hope that there will be some sort of a strong commitment made on the part of member states to strengthen indeed the governance, overall governance framework for outer space. Now, the months ahead should be used to accelerate diplomacy for the security and sustainability of outer space, and that process is just starting now, both internally within the UN Secretariat and, of course, by the member states. The Future Summit process will be co-facilitated by Germany and Namibia, and we are in touch with the co-facilitators very closely. I think maybe my final word is that progress in this area is all the more vital because of the current geopolitical circumstances, not despite, but because of the current circumstances. And success in this area will be essential for the well-being of future generations. So I think we need to really understand this not just as a current crisis issue, but also something that will define the well-being of our generations into the future. So very much the theme for Pact of the Future. I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to conversations, discussions with you. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Faust. I'm a senior staff writer at Space News, and I'm going to be moderating this moderated discussion with the Undersecretary General. So thank you for your remarks. I wanted to start off with the issue you brought up about this artificial divide between these two camps, between legally binding and non-legally binding approaches. It may be artificial, but it seems to be a very real divide, an entrenched divide, and we saw that recently with the votes in the first committee to establish two separate open-ended working groups, one for each of these approaches. So how do we bridge that that artificial yet very real gap to create progress in space governance?
Yes, thank you. I mean, one very clear thing that we have to do as the Secretariat is to make sure, or try to make sure, that these two processes will not go, sort of separate ways, but they will be complementary, and it has a certain type of synergy. Now, the argument that we have been making until today, and we will continue to make, is that the discussions that have started in the previous iteration of the open-ended working group on responsible behavior, norms and principles, those discussions, I think, were found to be really substantive, very useful by, I would say, vast majority of UN member states, including by vast majority, or I could even say almost all of the Global South as well. And those new norms of responsible behavior is not actually contradictory to a potential possible future legally binding agreements. In fact, those norms, not legally binding but politically binding norms, can become a basis for, or foundation for, or elements that can be actually enshrined in the future negotiation of a legally binding instrument. So we have to actually make sure that that will be the case between the two processes. Now, these two new open-ended working groups, the substantive work of those both open-ended working group will only start in 2025. And the Russia initiated the practical measures for the prevention of arms race in outer space. They will first look at the GGE that I mentioned that will have the first session in November, and that outcome from the GGE will be now first reviewed, and then that will be passed on to the future OEWG, the substantive session of which will start in 2025. So we do have some time between now and then to try to build synergies between the two. Now, I do share the concern that is shared by many, which is that there will have to be a lot of work time devoted to outer space discussions. I think there will be like 5 weeks of outer space multilateral discussions that member states will have to participate in. So there is definitely a capacity issue, but we need to make sure that we will take advantage of those two processes as much as possible. And as a secretariat, substantive secretariat, who will be supporting both processes, we will do our very best towards that end.
Yeah, I was going to ask, between these two open-ended working groups and the group of government experts, there's a concern maybe getting spread a little too thin, particularly for countries that don't have a lot of expertise, but yet you want to have involved. So how do you handle that challenge of, being as inclusive as possible with all of these countries as possible, but also not having so many discussions going on that people just can't, keep up?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because as you say, those conversations, those discussions will need to be inclusive. The United Nations norm development efforts have to always be a very inclusive process where countries that are not necessarily spacefaring nations, or not even have any capacity really so far to date to discuss those issues, should be part of those norm development discussions. So we are actually emphasizing a lot of our efforts, investing in reaching out to the sort of global membership of the United Nations. And one of the reasons that really is important why everyone should get involved is what I mentioned in my remarks also. Space capabilities, space assets are now really crucial for our daily lives, including the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. SDG implementation is really lagging behind. If we are to really change that, we need to leverage technologies, including outer space assets and capabilities. So I think emphasizing, the benefits of involved in multilateral international discussions from that angle, I think is something that is probably appealing to a wider spectrum of member states. But this also requires some capacity building. The kinds of capacity building efforts that we invested enormously in, for example, cybersecurity discussions, cyber security conversations, norm developments at the United Nations, it's been going on for more than 2 decades. But it's only in recent years that it's now seen to be and participated by almost the entirety of UN membership. And that's also a result of a lot of efforts that we invested in, together with various member states' support in capacity building efforts. Capacity building not just in terms of the actual cybersecurity issues, but in terms of cyber security policy making. Policy capacity needs to be developed at the global level.
So much of the activity going on in space that's causing this excitement, but also this concern, is being led by the private sector. SpaceX, for example, has just in the last few years become the largest satellite operator in the world with 5,000 satellites. It wasn't that long ago there weren't 5,000 satellites operating at all in space. How does the private sector be involved in this outside of simply working with their national governments to bring in both their expertise but also their issues and their concerns about this process?
Before this previous iteration of the Open-Ended Working Group on Responsible Behavior, we invested quite a lot in organizing seminars and webinars. I think some of you probably have participated in those conversations. We want to make sure that their expertise, their experiences, their concerns, and their contributions in general will be really tapped into. And so we will continue to make that efforts. Now, United Nations multilateral conversations, the decision-making authority or the power always rests with member states, and then we're not going to change that. But I think there is an increasing number, I would say vast majority of member states who now really understand that they in fact benefit from perspectives and contributions by private sector. And so there's a very strong interest on the part of governments as well to listen to and then request contributions and perspectives fed into intergovernmental discussions. So we will continue to organize those. And if you will, I think it's one of the roles that we need to play as the UN Secretariat, which is a catalytic role. We connect the dots between various communities so that the policy making, norm making processes will be a little bit more inclusive and comprehensive in terms of perspectives.
Besides the various activities going on in the UN, there are other initiatives, the ASAT testing moratorium being one example, with I think more than 36 countries now having signed on to that. How do those efforts align with what's going on at the UN in terms of either helping along certain efforts or potentially conflicting with them?
We welcomed it. When the moratorium declaration first came by the United States, we definitely thought it would be a useful inputs into what we were doing. It was in the middle of the Open-Ended Working Group on responsible behavior. And I think these kinds of, it's still limited in scope. It's just ASAT area. But I think, many states coming together and actually taking an initiative to declare that this is not something that will benefit. Quite the contrary, it's some actions that should not happen. We hope that this will also be part of an element of not just the responsible behavior norms, but also into, migrate into a future legally binding discussions. So we definitely did welcome, and we hope that it will be embraced and endorsed by as many as possible.
potentially dueling efforts like the Artemis Accords led by the U.S., now signed by 31 countries, and then the Chinese-led International Lunar Research Station, which now has about 7 countries that have signed on. Is there a potential now that we will set up sort of conflicting governance regimes with these 2 different agreements, and how can the UN prevent any sort of conflict that might stem from that?
Yeah, our line is very clear. We can't have a fragmented governance regime when it comes to outer space. How can we have 2 different sets of regimes? Our efforts will be definitely making sure that it will be a global effort, which is why the Secretary General issued this policy brief. He did not talk about different regimes, but he did talk about one regime to be discussed and negotiated. At the end of the day, if we actually do have a fragmented or divided arrangements, it's all of us who will lose. We have to make sure that, of course, outer space treaty is very basic, too basic, and it's, many people say it's outdated. It doesn't fit in the 21st century. But the spirit that was agreed upon that time, we hope will be a guiding principle as well.
You mentioned the Summit for the Future coming up next September, and the role you hope to see space taking part of that. What can we sort of realistically expect to come out of that in terms of anything involving space governance from that event?
Well, I don't know, I have to say, at the moment, because we are at the moment sort of analyzing what the priorities of member states are and how member states see these outer space issues. As I said, the negotiations for the pact has not started formally yet. It will be led by the co-facilitators, but our hope is that there will be a reference, made on the outer space issues where member states agree that this is a key issue and that they have to, start tackling those challenges in a very concrete way. Some sort of a commitment for member states to start a practical process for discussions and negotiations, I think will be quite important. And we will definitely working, on the sustainability issues led by, of course, Office for Outer Space Affairs based in Vienna, but we are working very closely with them. And our efforts from the UN Secretariat is to make sure that member states will be fully aware of and then prioritize these issues. Space is not the only area where technology has often outpaced governance. Cyberspace, AI, biotech, things like that come to mind. Are there lessons from those other areas that we can apply to space in terms of setting up a space governance regime? I think they are important lessons. One issue of it's a catchword, a multi-stakeholder process. We use it all the time. But essentially, the process of crafting governance and norms have to be inclusive beyond government entities. I think that's a very important lesson that we have learned from existing, existing processes like the cybersecurity area as well. I think there is also a key issue, especially in the arms control disarmament area, which is the very much focus on what it is that should be a responsible behavior, irresponsible behavior, threatening behavior. I think, the fact that the technologies themselves are largely today multi-purpose means that it's very difficult to regulate the technologies or capabilities themselves. So whatever the technologies that exist, we need to make sure how we use them. what defines a responsibility in terms of the use of new technologies and new domains, as both cyber and outer space are domains, new domains of human activity. So I think that's another lesson, not just a traditional approach in multilateral conversations, but also widen the scope and approaches in terms of multilateral efforts. I think that's another key lesson. The third one, perhaps, I would also put here, and this is, in a way, a challenging, a difficult one, which is that we need to look at the conversions of those technologies as well. I mean, there are different, separate discussions taking place, cybersecurity issues, AI starting big time now. But what are the conversions of those technologies? What's the linkages of those various technologies and domains and the linkage, how that might impact the security and, of course, the sustainability? This is difficult because the communities are different. We tend to, I mean, especially in disarmament, arms control area, we have a tendency a little bit of discussing those issues very much from a technical point of view in a silo. And then we need to actually break down the walls or break down the silos and then making sure that, you know, tackling biorisks, you know, what's the you know, enormous advancement of biotechnology and how AI might link into that. I mean, all these things actually need to be now looked at more comprehensively. In the UN system, it is also a challenge because we are mandate-based, and so we do have our own communities. So I think that's another very important lesson that we have learned from existing discussions taking place. And that's why I think it's important that at the future summit, we will take those issues a little bit more from a strategic overall point of view as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you break down those silos between those different disciplines, those different mandates. It sounds like that might be something that could be accomplished at the Summit for the Future.
I'm talking about just the UN system, but we are making visible efforts. I mean, let's just use, I will use the area of biorisk. Already since 2018, the Secretary General has created a new UN working group on biorisk, where 30 UN entities and also Interpol, World Animal Health Organizations, I mean non-UN organizations have joined to look at the biorisks more comprehensively. And I co-chair that together with WHO. So, you know, there is a very serious efforts to break down the silos in such a way that we bring our comparative advantages, knowledge, expertise together so that we will be collectively able to look at those issues more comprehensively. So I think those efforts should be happening across the board, and that also includes outer space issues as well. I mean, it's very clear the benefits are enormous. We need to make sure that we maximize the benefits of use of outer space. And at the same time, we have to minimize or address the risks. So it's the common sort of lessons that we all need to learn collectively.
Our time here is running out. I did want to ask one final question. You know, it's clear anyone who's been following this industry knows the rapid growth in space technology, new applications, new satellites, and so on, is at a very different pace than the pace of diplomacy and space diplomacy. How can space diplomacy catch up or keep up with what's going on with space technology so that space technology simply doesn't run away and either solves all the problems or creates intractable problems that can't be solved by diplomacy?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, it applies to all areas. I mean, I said that AI discussions, governance for AI is starting big time. I mean, now everyone is focused on AI. it is absolutely true, it's a fact that multilateral discussions, conversations take much longer than one would hope, and technology is really outpacing us all. The fundamental requirement to counter that is for states to really understand that it is in their joint collective interest to speed up their conversations. Otherwise, it could become too late, and the cost of that happening, as I said, is just enormous. I mean, it's not just in the current generation, but it's going to be there for generations to come. So the UN, United Nations, I often say UN is you. United Nations is member states. So the member states, despite the current, tension, competition, etc., member states coming to understand that it's in their collective interest is the fundamental requirements in pushing forward our discussions. And we, of course, as the UN Secretariat, we will continue to push member states and do our best to sort of accelerate the conversations. And I think a lot of people here from private sector or the space agencies, I think they can add their voices, right? I mean, because they know how serious the impact will be of non-action. So I hope that we can collectively make that efforts.
Well, something to look forward to. Thank you, Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, and thank all of you. We've got a first of two panels coming up momentarily. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Christopher Chiba. I'll be moderating this first panel. I have a joint appointment at Princeton University in astrophysics and in the School of Public and International Affairs. Despite that, I feel obliged to say that I do have one great advantage this morning, which is that I'm by far the least knowledgeable person on this panel, and quite possibly the least knowledgeable person in the room. And that gives me an advantage as a moderator that I can ask simple, naive questions, to which our panel members can then give sophisticated and nuanced answers. As you know, this morning's panel is titled The Democratization of Space. Over the next hour and a half or hour and a quarter, I hope we'll have a chance to discuss some of the evolution of the space environment away from being the domain of a small number of major powers to an environment that is increasingly accessed by a disparate number of states and commercial entities, and what that means for international security, the global economy, and global governance. And to help us think through those questions, we're joined this morning by a very impressive panel. Ms. Laura Delgado-Lopez is a visiting fellow with the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, currently on leave from NASA. She's worked in space policy in Washington, D.C. for nearly 15 years, with a research agenda focusing on emerging space programs, international cooperation, and public opinion. Mr. Mark Jochimik, since 2018, has been head of the Washington, D.C. office for DLR, Germany's National Center for Aerospace, Energy, and Transportation Research. Mr. Jochimik holds degrees in geography and business research. Has been working at DLR since 2007. Previously at the German Space Agency at DLR and in international relations and in the International Relations Department. Dr. Masami Onoda is director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, representing that agency in the United States and throughout the Americas. Dr. Onoda has extensive experience in international affairs, space policy, and industry relations, and holds a PhD in global environmental studies, a master's degree in environmental management, and a BA in international relations. And then finally, joining us today virtually is Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan, who is director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Dr. Rajagopalan was the technical advisor to the United Nations Group of Government Experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space from 2018 to 2019. She joined the Observer Research Foundation after 5 years at the National Security Council Secretariat within the Government of India, where she was an assistant director. So I'm going to begin the discussion this morning by asking members of the panel a small number of questions and then inviting other members of the panel to respond to that initial response. We'll then proceed to take questions from those in the live audience and also individuals online. So my first question is for Dr. Delgado Lopez. So the panel's titled The Democratization of Space. Right? I understand that with falling launch costs, there's a democratization in access to space. But clearly, democratization must mean more than that. So can you explain, how would you characterize what the meaning of that term? And also, why is it happening now? And where is it going to take us in the coming decades?
Wow, great question. Thank you for that, and thank you so much to the Stimson Center and to Princeton for the opportunity. You're right. I think it means not just access to the technology. I think that is a big part of that, of course, with lowering launch costs, as you mentioned, and the keynote speaker talked about some of those trends, right? We have commercially available technologies that are just making it a lot easier for even, groups of students to be able to do the technology, right? But the way I see it, democratization also kind of captures the why, the differences in why and the who, right? And so, again, hearkening back to the discussion we just had in this room, we're seeing this incredible diversity of actors participating in dialogue about space, about what you do, why you do it, how you do it. And so it's democratization in that sense of the participatory activity of what that looks like. Where is it going? I think there's a lot of positive impetus on the one hand, and you hear a lot about the trillion-dollar economy and all those things. I'm a little bit more skeptical about all of that panning out that way. I do think space is here to stay because, as I mentioned, the whys are different, and I think the newer actors coming into space are demonstrating that space isn't just cool, and in fact, a lot of them aren't doing it because it's cool. They want to kind of minimize that aspect. They're really attracted to the concrete benefits that they get out of those investments. And so I think space is here to stay. And so it's not a matter of, the democratization of space leading to, it going away or anything like that. But it does lead to very complex interactions among those players. And so as a keynote speaker discussed, is it the private sector voice vis-a-vis countries and all that? But even within countries, right? I study emerging space nations, particularly in the region of Latin America. And you see that, they have many constraints on the size of the delegations, et cetera, that can participate in some of these discussions. There's gaps between the institutions that participate and their level of expertise. So there's a number of challenges, right? I would say, to end, and I want to hear what my colleagues have to say, I think what we see is just chaos, in a way that's also positive, but it's a chaotic environment where those conversations are happening.
Are there other members of the panel, or Dr. Rajagopalan, would you like to comment on this topic? I'm sorry, we don't quite have sound. Okay, we'll proceed here on stage. And the hopes that we get your connection working. Other members of the panel, if not, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. So, okay, please.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah, okay. I think you touched upon very important points, and I think it's a multifaceted answer to that question you raised. I think especially the fact that many, let's say, consumers, and that's not the typical standard person, but organizations and government organizations, things like that, also companies, now got aware that space has something to offer for them. There's a real benefit, and that's also a driving force, of course, towards the democratization of space. So there's really a market developing, and so there's also a driving force for the traditional space companies, or for new space companies to enter that market and offer products, because there's a real uptake of those products. Meanwhile, people are aware that space-based services, space-based data is really adding value to their businesses, and when we look at the private investments, for example, in space, that's a relatively new thing, other than the, let's say, traditional satellite communication market with geostationary satellites. That was the only area where we had private investments until, I think, the late 2010s. And then slowly, or then not so slowly, but then suddenly LEO investments were done, or private investments into LEO, and also some suborbital human spaceflight. So this is a relatively new phenomenon that we have private investments because there's a market, and it's growing rapidly, and the awareness of users for the uptake of the services is growing really rapidly. And that's also part of, because of space agencies like our space agency, we're really actively trying to get out the information that space has something to offer aside it's cool and it's adding scientific results. It's really is added value to everyday businesses.
And so is this part of why I need to think of the democratization of space as extending beyond countries with space agencies, that are themselves space powers or nascent space powers? It extends much more broadly than that.
Definitely, but also within traditional space countries or any country, this is an extension of the, let's say, customer base for space-derived products.
And I will add quickly, that's never been a requirement to participate, say, in the United Nations, where, you know, every country, even in the very beginning of the space age, the core treaties were signed onto by countries that at the time weren't even utilizing space, even you know, the downstream applications, right? I think where you see the shift is now those same countries that were participating then, maybe just by default, now we're seeing it as part of their national interest to, you know, protect their access to those resources.
Dr. Onoda, did you wish to?
Yes, from adding a little bit more maybe specificity to this, about 20 years ago, I was working in Osaka in Japan with a group of small factories who wanted to make a satellite. That time was when this small sat kind of frenzy was just starting, and the innovation that made this happen to me was like just a way of changing the way you think. Is how about you have a constellation instead of a satellite the size of this room to enhance, and we were all, take the example of Earth observation, trying to enhance spatial resolution by enlarging and sophisticating, and then now with some people came up with the idea, what if we had multiple satellites that enhanced the time resolution and compensated with the resolution of maybe Landsat, but with the enormous enhance of time resolution, meaning the frequency of the observation, so that you can actually compensate. And that's actually what we're seeing today with all these mega constellations. And at that time, we never knew that it would be thousands or tens of thousands. But this really took off. And so that enabled also the size of the satellite to be smaller and affordable, and enabled even people who'd never done space, like the factory people I was working in Osaka, to work with. And people kept coming into our office with not just satellites, but new plans that they wanted to bring to space and new everything. And these were people who were not engaged in space at all. And I was in the week before last in Dubai speaking with the UAE, people who said, oh, we decided to, in our first small satellite mission, decided to work with the Koreans. This was DubaiSat, because they learned from the British how to make a satellite. So we thought we learned from somebody who learned successfully. And that was very interesting. And so this is, in my view, some concrete examples of, what people might see as democratization. And I think this is part of it. When you bring it to the national scale, many different entrants will come in. If you bring it to the economy, then this combined with the Silicon Valley style new IT investment, and then it becomes really what we're seeing today. So, it combines with a lot of things. I have witnessed, I feel, the very start of it with the technical, and not even really technical, the idea of having more satellites covering the Earth to be much more smaller, lighter, cost effective. And so, yeah, there are multiple aspects to this.
Well, I hope we have our connectivity established. And Dr. Rajagopalan, please, if you wish to weigh in on this.
Yes, please. Thank you. And I hope my connection is better and it's audible. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. My thanks to both the Stimson and Princeton for giving me this opportunity. But on the subject of the democratization of space, I think I'll just add my bit from looking at it from a developing country perspective. Many developing countries around the world, especially those countries in developing countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they have just begun to appreciate how space can change lives for the better. So there are more and more countries across this region who have just entered the space sector. Everyone does not have the launch capabilities, but for that matter, the whole world has come to be dependent on space one way or the other, whether they have the launch capabilities or not. And all of this has become possible because space has been democratized, access to space has become easier, the entry barriers have been lowered, and cost of access overall, when you look at it, is much lower, of course, in relative terms. And I think this has primarily been made possible with the arrival of the private sector, especially the new space actors that have brought down the cost, because many of them do not have huge establishment cost or logistic expense and so forth, all of which have been helpful in keeping the cost down. So cheaper access, lower barriers to technology have all made it possible. There is also the private sector does do business for a number of different reasons, for social, economic reasons. And also there's one of the other mantras that I keep hearing about is the diversity that they need to see in the space sector, and also diversity along with that inclusivity in a sense. And I think that has become the mantra for, I've heard from a lot of the Western industry houses, companies, smaller companies, but also this is not just limited to the Western context. There are a lot many more companies in India and around in Asia that I keep hearing about as to how this was primarily seen as a monopoly by the West, but that is now being broken down, and countries around the world, other stakeholders around the world are also becoming active partners in this regard, in a sense. So that is becoming very, very clear. But along with all of the other benefits that we see, there is also the geopolitical driver that is kind of pushing the kind of new sets of actors, new sets of activities in space. And I think that is bringing certain amount of the competitive dynamics that we already see, especially when it comes to international cooperation as it pertains to global governance aspects and so on and so forth. So you have an exciting moment at this point of time. There is the sort of a booming of private sector actors across the world. This is primarily a Western phenomena, but I think even in the non-Western context, whether it's in India, China, Japan, all of these countries, Australia, a lot of the private sector players, whether they are new space enterprises, startups, or small and medium-sized enterprises, and there are a few big industries that are engaged in developing space assets in a sense, in a big way. But I think this is also, along with all this excitement, there is also the kind of competitive dynamics, especially I see this playing out in Asia, and of course, the global governance debates when you look at it, and some of which was, many of those aspects were covered by Undersecretary General Dr. Izumi when she was making the keynote address. So I think that's another set of issues that we need to keep in mind. Along with all the excitement, there are also certain risks, there are certain challenges. Space has become crowded, congested, and it may be a very cliched sort of a phrase, but the fact is that they're all very true. Space is crowded, congested, and of course now contested and competitive as well. So it's an exciting time, but at the same time, there are also challenges that we need to deal with. And first and foremost, the challenges that we need to deal with is in terms of framing some new rules of the road that would kind of moderate the kind of activities that we engage in outer space.
Last comments in particular lead right into my next question, which I'll direct to Dr. Onoda. In addition to these discussions of democratization of space, of course, there's a corresponding discussion about space sustainability. I think we all recognize that sustainability, at a minimum, includes issues of debris creation, and space debris, in some senses, is the gift that the previous space powers have given to the coming space powers. But in addition to debris creation, what do you understand the term sustainability to encompass? And then do we need, and without stepping on the toes too much of the afternoon panel, do we need a new regulatory regime to address space sustainability issues?
Again, since I started from Osaka this morning, I'm going to stick to it and also trying to bring the discussion a little bit down to earth, so to say. This a group of people I worked in Osaka, now it's been some time, this came up with, because the economy in Osaka was declining, we thought space might be able to boost it. Some people thought if they had something like a space village in Osaka, maybe it will boost the declining then economy that was, shifting and concentrating in Tokyo. So this was the thought behind it. We started this small satellite program on which a lot of young university students worked, and now today they work in various different new space we call startups in Japan, amongst which is one of them that focuses on space debris removal, because it's also a satellite technology, and they have hired quite a few back from them. So I guess the talent pool is small. That's another problem that we have to extend the talent pool. So this now focus together with the industry and the emerging market that we hope to be having in Japan about space debris removal and space sustainability in general is something the Japanese government is also very much heavily supporting. Space sustainability, it could therefore include many, many aspects, including not just the availability, accessibility of the space environment, but maybe also sometimes the economic sustainability of it. And there's so many ways we can look at it. Then focusing specifically on space debris removal, we are having a project working with a startup to demonstrate removal of a upper stage of a rocket, which is a very large, becomes a very large piece of debris. So the idea is by removing this, we can effectively remove something that is potentially, could be shattered into many, many pieces. So that could be an effective way to tackle the problem. We will be hopefully demonstrating this towards later this fiscal Japanese year, and then move on to the second stage, which will be actually removing it. The first is demonstrating the technology to approach and monitor the debris. So there are lots of challenges there, not just technical, but also that the debris that you can remove has to, in our case, has to be ours, because we cannot remove, because of regulatory issues or ownership issues, you cannot just remove anybody's. And this also is something probably that has to be dealt with. There are many, many practical issues that we have to see around this. But from the space agency point of view, actually starting this technology, demonstrating it is, in our view, a first step to technically contribute to the problem solving.
Thank you. I believe Dr. Rajagopalan would like to, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to, especially since our colleague brought out the whole technology to remove space debris, and I think that's an important aspect, especially when you're looking at a whole lot of new technologies that come about, in a sense, whether it is technology for removing space debris or on-orbit satellites and servicing technology, and these are essentially primarily defensive technologies that are primarily being used for remotely repairing, remotely refueling the satellite so that you are able to extend the life of a satellite, or cleaning up the space from all the junk that has been created over the past several decades, in a sense. But the fact is that we haven't even begun the conversations on who removes the junk, who removes whose junk, which piece can you remove around. And there is also, especially given the kind of geopolitical environment that we are in, the great power competition that we see, or major power competition, because it's not just restricted to the US and China, because there are also other rivalries, major power rivalries that are sort of hampering the process of sort of having any effective discussions on many of these issues. So we haven't even begun to talk about as to how do we decide what is to be removed and so on and so forth. There is also the whole lot of suspicion about when these technologies are being developed, even though these are purely defensive technologies, because of the kind of competition and this rivalry, suspicion surrounding each other in terms of their relationship. And there is a suspicion that if you have developed a particular technology to remove a piece of debris, the same technology can be used in a nefarious manner, that can be used to disrupt a satellite functioning, that can be used to destroy a particular satellite, and so on and so forth. So there are disruptive ways of using the same technology, same defensive technology. So those are also issues, and we haven't even begun that kind of conversations. And to be honest, I'm not particularly hopeful that we are sort of going in the right direction in terms of our ability to develop consensus in a meaningful fashion. And then the previous keynote speaker talked about the kind of divergences that we see, huge divergences in terms of the between different schools of thought. In terms of, one is of course the legally binding mechanisms and the sort of political agreements and so on and so forth. But even to have an effective discussion, a debate on many of these issues, how do we use space in a sustainable manner? How do we essentially build certain basic norms of responsible behavior so that we don't make space completely polluted, we don't make space unusable, because the usable orbits in space are limited in nature. We all think that space is somehow infinite, but that is not really the case. The usable orbits are limited in scope, limited in nature. So unless we engage in activities that are sustainable, that are going to lead to a sustainable future for future generations to use, the manner in which we currently use the current trends, going by the current trends, it is very sort of I'm not particularly hopeful that we are going to be able to use space in an uninterrupted fashion, even in the medium term.
Do other members of the panel wish to, please?
Yeah, you touched on how different countries kind of perceive space sustainability and all that, and I wanted to add, related to the comments of the previous panelists, that for the countries I'm studying, this idea of protecting their future access is inherently tied to sustainability, because they see, the launch of these very large constellations, and because they recognize, as Raji was pointing out, that space is not infinite. even if today they only have 1 or 2 satellites, they don't want to be left out of the discussions so that then, 10 years, 5 years down the line, they can't launch their own satellites. They can't pursue those activities, right? And so I think it's a very interesting kind of difference in prioritization, right, and in how you approach the conversation. Because I sometimes get the question of why is country X or Y, which doesn't have a large space program, engaging in, say, the lunar governance and sustainability discussions, because they see that as an extension of, okay, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of possibility for conflict and competition and all that, and if it becomes polluted, or if there's conflict again, or if it's just the sheer volume of activities, then we may not be able to participate, and we see that connection with the national interest, right? And so from that sense, that is, I think, very common in sort of the small nation or emerging nation, whatever terminology you want to use, approach to the sustainability discussion.
Let me just ask a follow-up, if I may. Do these discussions of sustainability, these international discussions, do they include attentiveness to maintaining dark skies? How much attention is given to that issue?
I think it's been kind of a side conversation because it's been more focused, scientific community kind of looking at that. And then you get interesting just geographic distributions, say, because some countries, say, in the global south, because of the geographic location, have particularly, astronomy is more highly priced, and they have a lot of activity in that area. And so they're more concerned about that than, say, other countries. I think that is part of it, and I've seen a little bit of that in the lunar context in terms of, preserving, is it the far side, is a radio quiet zone, a little bit of that, but I don't think it's on the list of the top 5 priorities in the sustainability debate.
Mr. Jurkovic, did you want to comment on this, or shall we?
Yes, I'd like to. Sustainability is one of the 9 key topics in the just recently published new space strategy of the federal government of Germany. So end of September, this was published, and sustainability is a very high priority. So we look into all the different aspects of sustainability, and of course a strong focus also on technology solutions like active debris removal, for example, but also, and just yesterday on the level of the European Space Agency, the new ESA, European Space Agency policy for zero space debris in 2030 was adopted and agreed upon. So this is a very important step on the European level, and we consider Europe being at the forefront with this step and leading by example there. For example, that there are different measures in this policy, but one, for example, is reducing the time that large deactive objects like upper stages of launchers are allowed to remain in orbit before they deorbit. So currently there's this 25-year rule, and now ESA is aiming at having this below 5 years, for example. There are other things in that satellite operators are advised to hold back remaining fuel for active deorbiting of their satellites, and if that's not happening, there's a mandate for active debris removal of those objects. So there are different steps and different aspects in that. Also technology or design regulations, or no, not regulations, but design principles for satellites that prevent defunct satellites to explode and to create space debris. So a lot of aspects are covered with that, and this is something which I think is very aspirational, and very, very good that now ESA has taken the step, and hopefully other nations will look into that and try to implement it also for actors from their nation, for example.
So let me ask another follow-up, if I may. Of course, that some of these measures have been called for decades within the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee. Those aren't legally binding documents, but they're political promises. And yet, a number of powers have rather egregiously violated those requirements, or one doesn't have the sense that these political exhortations have necessarily have been sufficient to the problem. So how do we do better than that going forward?
That's a good question. How do we do better? I think, for example, for active debris removal, we have a Masami mentioned startup, the Japanese startup. I think you were referring to Astroscale, probably. Just name the companies. We can do some PR for our companies.
So technology will help us do better. Is that the
technology will help us do that? Of course, it's tricky for some of the technologies. It will be hard to have a real commercial market for that. Of course, who's going to pay for active debris removal if there's no regulation forcing the owner of the satellite to pay for it? Of course, that will be a tricky question. But for other things that like in-orbit servicing mentioned already, which will extend lifetime of satellites and thus also reduce creation of debris, there is a market already. There are some U.S. companies having contracts with communication satellite operators doing that, and there's a lot of technology development and companies that are getting ready to do this servicing and get into the servicing market. So there are areas where new technologies coming together with market opportunities will help us reduce space debris. In other areas where there's probably no real commercial markets, space agencies will have to step in, at least at the beginning, to support this development and create some, let's say, public markets for that, and regulation will have to follow on, and then there will be also maybe real markets for active debris removal, for example.
You have once again anticipated my next question, which was going to go to you, which is, we've talked about, and you especially have spoken about the benefits of commercial space actors. Could you identify some of the challenges that are coming with the explosion of commercial space?
Yeah, it's also explosion of commercial space, yes. Of course, there's also some kind of regulatory and legal aspects coming with that. Germany doesn't yet have a space law, for example, so that's also part of our space strategy, that we aiming to develop that in a very short time frame. How do states regulate their space economy, and how can they make sure that actors from their country act in a way that it adheres to international laws and the regulatory regime? So that these are challenges that can be solved by national legal initiatives and national laws. However, of course, every state will try to, reach this minimal objective of adherence to international law while not hampering their space economy, of course. That's a big discussion also going on, of course, in the US with commercial entities talking with lawmakers and trying to make sure that any regulation will not give them a disadvantage in competition. So that's a very interesting policy and regulatory question, and we will have to see how different nations tackle that question, for example.
And another challenge related to that is we're going to see as the private sector starts providing critical services, launch to the ISS is one thing, for example, but as we saw in the war in Ukraine, services that are commercial but that are used in a defense context, right? It's going to create dependencies and risks. And so I think you see the governments are going to have to figure out what the risk posture is about what are they willing to, put on the private sector to provide services and capabilities, what things they still want to operate and fully own and develop on their own. And that balancing act as we were just discussing, is going to be a challenge also because the government wants to support that private sector while also protecting its own interest. And so I think we're seeing a bit of, in some instances, even here in the United States, a bit of policy conflict because of that. Because at the end of the day, it's not just a policy question. There's the regulatory piece and all of that, and then there's the national security interests.
Do other members of the panel wish to comment on this question?
So
Dr.
challenges with commercialization. Yeah, coming back to Osaka again, and I was born in Massachusetts, by the way, so my attachment to Osaka comes from elsewhere. So this was about the time that we, in Japan, we established the basic law for space and also the basic plan for space policy. So we completely changed the governance structure in Japan for space policy, where the Science and Technology Ministry was in charge in the early stage, and I think they did a great job for this, but time had come for the industry security side to have more focus on. Therefore, we had a new basic law, new structure where the Cabinet Office, a sort of an equivalent to the National Space Council here, the National Space Strategic Headquarters takes the leadership in, so focus more on security, more on industry, and R&D actually comes kind of third. So, but it's always been there. And so we then have now, so it's been 15 more years. So they started working in the early 2000s. Then 2008, we had the basic law and the new structure coming in. So it's about 15 years or so now. So what we are seeing today now is the result of the change, the governance structure change that we made, so that actually next fiscal year, they're going to change the law for JAXA to be able to add a function for us to give grants to industry. And it's almost, we're talking possibly a 50% increase of JAXA in a way you see it, but it's not for JAXA projects, it's for giving to the industry, and we have the mandate to select this, all of this, but still, this is yet to become law yet, so we'll see what happens, but being Japanese, what we say we do, we usually do. And this is going to be happening in a very short time span, maybe in the next few months, because next fiscal year is starting April next year. So stay tuned. We do try to, therefore, heavily try to invest and support commercial activities in Japan because we see this a vital component for our space, overall space industry to support our civil and security space, government space also. And what comes with that also is yes, the challenge of rulemaking, abiding by regulations. But as I said, we did actually work from the legal part, and we have the licensing scheme. We have 4 launches for satellites also, and now for resource development on the moon, lunar surface. So I think it is very, now seeing back 15, 20 years, it's very important to have this whole scheme in mind, and somebody really clever in Japan must have had this. Hope to be part of it, but we really all worked very hard and hope to be keeping up with this internationally as well.
Thank you. Dr. Rajagopalan, please.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to add, and I agree with my colleagues, their comments on the private sector participation in the space program. And when you look at mostly in the Asian context, I think it's been, most of the space programs have been primarily led by the state agencies in a sense. So they do appreciate as to what the private sector brings in terms of the huge benefits, in terms of the cost, in terms of their ability to do things in a much more quickly the ability to respond to things quickly and so on and so forth. But I think they also struggle a lot in terms of how much do they want to share that space with others. because they are also emerging as a competitor to the state agencies that have actually enjoyed certain amount of monopoly. And certainly this is the case for India. India has been struggling with this on this front for quite some time, despite the fact that, for instance, it has been making a space policy for a very long time, for more than a decade. And finally, we have an Indian space policy 2023 that came out a few months ago. But again, it's it's good that they primarily the space policy talks about how do we engage the private sector. And again, this has come out of actually compulsions, because the ISRO, the Indian Space Research Agency for space organization, research organization, has had difficulties in meeting the growing set of demands on India's space assets, in a sense. So they are not able to keep up. There are capacity deficits, and because of which now they are increasingly having to rely on, depend on space talent that is available outside of this ISRO, in a sense. This is a case for some of the other countries as well. So many of the Asian countries are actually now finally beginning to embrace private sector commercial actors as an important stakeholder contributing to the space growth trajectory for their because they have come down with serious difficulties in meeting the demands. One other point to the question that you earlier asked about political versus legal agreements, in terms of, there are those debates, but to me, legal agreements alone, legal agreements do not guarantee good behavior, or they have been broken in the past, and even legal measures have been broken, those commitments have been violated, and so on and so forth. So it does not give me any sort of sense of confidence that once you sign on to a legal piece of instrument, as far as the regulations, future rules of the roads are concerned, we are going to have a safe, secure, and sustainable use of space by all the space actors, in a sense. It doesn't give me that confidence at all. In fact, to the contrary, if we can build the political agreement as the first step, first baby step that is required in terms of our ability to develop confidence in each other, trust in each other, because today it's absolutely completely lack of trust that is actually the problem. So whether it is in terms of a political instrument or a legal instrument, it's essentially because most countries, especially this group of countries that argue for a legally binding mechanism, saying that that is going to be essentially leading to better compliance and so on and so forth. That is not really the case if you look back in history, whether it is in relation to other technologies, or even in the space domain, commitments have been broken. So I'm not particularly a big fan of legally binding mechanism as a way of guaranteeing good behavior or a responsible behavior in space, so that we can use space in a sustainable fashion.
Thank you. I will ask one more question, and then we'll open it to the floor. But before I ask that question, I want to ask a footnote question, which is, with respect to commercial actors, are we going to face a problem of flags of convenience, where the commercial actors search for a country to be the launch platform that they choose because they expect that to give them the fewest, the easiest regulatory environment? Okay, I'll leave that hanging. I'll just put that out there.
I think my first thought was that even finding and trying to navigate each regulatory system is so complex that, I don't know, my first thought was all the power to them if they can figure it out. But yeah, I think it's harder than it looks. And I'll say, for example, Brazil has been trying to attract launch companies to its Alcântara Launch Center for a long time, and in 2019 signed a technology safeguards agreement with the United States that, on paper allows U.S. companies to take advantage of that facility. And there hasn't been a lot of uptake on that.
Well, the company doesn't exist anymore. The company that was driving that was Virgin Orbit.
Oh, yes, so. Fair. The first one that signed on, right? And so the space is there. Obviously, it shows you that there's other requirements for companies to find that location attractive. It's not just the benefits of the location that's so close to the equator, right? There's other aspects from a business standpoint, maybe a regulatory standpoint. And so I don't think we're quite there, that there's going to be a rush for.
Okay. Thank you. My last question is for Dr. Rajagopalan, and it's sometimes, it used to be at least asserted that space was a sanctuary, and then there was a fervent response in some quarters that space is not that. We're seeing an explosion now, and sorry, I'll stop using that word. We're seeing the exploration of cislunar space is about to take off. That's a much better metaphor. Right, the space beyond geosynchronous Earth orbit and the Lagrange points, say, around the Earth Moon Lagrange points.
Right.
Should cislunar space be a sanctuary? Are there steps we can take to try to ensure that it's a sanctuary? What would that mean, and what would we do? Or is that the wrong objective?
No, I think it's an important noble objective because I think we need to, if we have, and more players, and I would say more and more players, we can, including all the different stakeholders that you can see who are engaged in cislunar activities, so lunar exploration, lunar sort of traffic management issues. There are a number of different issues that you can look at, even with regard to lunar and cislunar activities. And I think you will see more and more players coming into this domain for a number of different reasons. One, I think it's become fashionable to go back to moon again. And also many countries are planning to make lunar space as a base for further interplanetary missions. So that's another thing to look at. Additionally, countries and other stakeholders are looking at sort of a moon for fueling purposes, water, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of different reasons, but there is also the factor of geopolitics. Geopolitics has become an important driver of for many of the kind of pursuits, the lunar pursuits that we see today. India just sort of soft landed on the southern pole of the moon. Again, this was the Chandrayaan-3 mission, the third mission that India was undertaking. The second one being a crash land, sort of a hard landing and not a soft landing in 2019. And this was the third undertaking that India was doing. But again, ISRO may not really come out and say that this was part of a competitive sort of a dynamics. But the fact is that China has done a lot more, and we also want to do. We may be, we are not as the Indian space program may not be as big, but India also does want to stay on in the race and be part of that competitive dynamics in a sense. That's also coming into play. But I think the more worrying aspect is that we like again during the keynote, the Q&A after the discussion, we did see the kind of we have, when you talk about the lunar governance structures, we have Artemis Accords on the one side, and to which India and other countries became part of it, and some of the Asian countries have been part of it. Then you have the Russia-China proposal, the International Lunar Research Station, ILRS proposal, which has not seen too many takers at this point of time. I think I can count maybe 3 countries in addition to Russia and China being part of that proposal at this point of time. But the fact is that we are seeing a very fractured sort of a debate in terms of fractured structures, already kind of the fractured structures are emerging. And that's not going to be very helpful in terms of our ability to kind of, because we need to have a shared understanding of how we engage in, what are the kind of activities we engage in, because you're also going to have serious issues in terms of space situational awareness with regard to space. And space traffic management, again, that's going to become a major issue. All of those issues in the today's context, when you look at it, they have been with regard to the low Earth orbits we have been talking about. We have not really looked at this lunar space and related these two, especially SSA and space traffic management. So how do we get some of these basic concepts built into some of the governance measures, governance discussions is something that we need to look into. But again, it's the great power rivalry and the kind of divisiveness that we see today is not very helpful. It's in some sense, when we look at some of these debates, it's kind of, what are we kind of waiting for? Are we waiting for a major catastrophic incident to happen in space? And then we realize that we should have actually agreed on some sort of basic rules of the road so that we are able to use space in a sustainable manner, or even use our ability to use space even in the medium term remained sort of somewhat guaranteed in a sense. But the kind of science that we see, the kind of trends that we see in terms of whether it is lunar governance issues, lunar exploration, or even the broader outer space kind of activities, the kind of capabilities that are being developed, the kind of counter space capabilities that are being developed, again, talked about a great deal in the keynote speech and thereafter the discussion, whether it is using cyber measures or electronic warfare, and so on and so forth. None of these are being helpful. So in regard to lunar space, but also in terms of the broader global governance measures, we are not making much progress. We have at the same simultaneously, we at the simultaneous kind of different processes, different tracks, parallel tracks are running. You need to use all platforms, all possible measures to see how we can develop those discussions, and if we can reach some sort of a common, a shared understanding of what the challenges are and what the possible solutions are. It's good, but in today's international political climate, I seem not particularly hopeful about how we are going to go about with regard to these issues.
Thank you. Do any other members of the panel wish to discuss cislunar space? Or okay.
Well, I think it's probably, rather than having it sanctuary, it's maybe more likely like a national park. Just pack in what you brought, for example. So extending, the sustainability discussion is already including cislunar space, and I think we just have to extend the whole efforts to be sustainable or, to include cislunar space. I think that's the way to go, and that then also includes aspects like keeping all the options open for developing space countries for future endeavors, however they may look, and not factually block them from doing their own science by changing the environment of the lunar surface in certain areas, for example.
Thank you. Well, let me open the discussion to.
Yeah.
Okay, so did you?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to open the
No,
discussion.
it's essentially like the. Sorry. No, go ahead. Let's take more questions on the floor.
Okay. To open the conversation to questions from the floor, let me start here in the front, and then we'll go to the back. Victoria. And please identify yourself with your question.
Sure. Victoria Sampson, Secure World Foundation. Thank you to the panel for this good discussion. My question is specific for Laura Lopez, although I'd love to hear the rest of the panelists' thought of this. This topic is the democratization of space, and I think a lot of people, when they hear that, think, okay, democratization of access to space in terms of launch vehicles or having one's own satellite. But I would argue it's almost more important to have the democratization of space data. And for emerging space countries, how much discussion is going on in terms of, well, should we get our own satellite to check off the space station, or would our money be better spent to purchase more exquisite data that's more in tune to our needs? I might be like weighing the scales here in terms of how I think about this, but I'd be curious to know if this discussion is happening at the international level. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So it is happening, but it's a very fragmented conversation. So some other countries I'm looking at, for example, are very active. You know, we've been talking about the United Nations. There's something called UNGGIM, which I shouldn't try to spell it out. United Nations Group of Geospatial. Let's just say geospatial, because I'm not going to remember all the letters. But so that has to do with the use and management and access to information, right? Including space, but not limited to space. And you have some countries, like Mexico, for example, extremely active in that kind of community, and regionally, internationally, and thinking through those hard questions about how do you create those institutional frameworks and all of that to actually gain access to and leverage information, including publicly accessible information. But except for maybe Mexico, it's very rare where that conversation includes the space community. Like those run on separate tracks. And so again, think about smaller countries and countries where maybe those institutional bridges aren't built. You then have, some countries participating, say, on the group on Earth observations in one hand, not in UNGGIM on the other. And again, we've been talking about this kind of fatigue and how much are you investing that actually at the end of the day connects to using data for decision making. I don't think we're seeing the benefits of that yet. And part of it, to your question, countries are talking about it. They're still talking about it as an access problem. I would argue there's two problems running on separate tracks. There might be an access problem, and I agree with, free access to data for scientific use, disaster management, or certain applications where that's absolutely critical. But my frustration is that even when that data gets to some of these countries, because of all these conversations happening in different tracks, it's not going to make a difference. So I'm almost to the point where let's hold off on that for a second. Let's talk about what you need to do nationally to make sure that country A that's investing in developing its own satellites is also not having its own Ministry of Agriculture going off and buying imagery. That then it's not going to be used. So it's less of from that standpoint. I think I would love to see the conversation shift a little bit to access and democratization as you shall give me, and so that I can use, but also to countries that have established such frameworks, which doesn't need to be just the global north or whatever. It's countries at any stage of development that have established those frameworks to demonstrate that these are the steps that you need to put in place, so that once you get the data, whether you developed it yourself or you bought it or you got it from the Charter for Space and Major Disasters, you can actually put it to good use.
Yeah,
Other comments from the panel on this?
definitely,
topic?
yeah. I totally agree. I think when you look at Europe with Copernicus as the environmental Earth observation system in Copernicus, there's a free and open data policy, so anyone can use the data, and even though Germany is very heavily contributing to the space segment of this system and through the European Commission and through ESA to the build-up of Copernicus, this is the traditional space industry and space community working on that. We really early in the build-up of Copernicus found out that actually the end users to ensure the uptake, they really need to be taken by the hand and brought really to the source of the data, and not only that, showing them where the data is, but giving them examples and supporting them and setting up demonstration projects, how to use the data. I'm talking about local and state agencies that use data, for example, Earth observation data for the observation of water quality. They were traditionally measuring water quality all over the place where their responsibility lies. And they may have heard of this new thing, Earth observation, that can help us somewhat, but they didn't have the know-how and they didn't have the contacts and the experience. So what we did in Germany was establishing a German Copernicus portal and a German Copernicus support program, which then brought together commercial entities that work in the field of Earth observation, brought together local and state actors and agencies that were the ideal recipients of this new services and data, and matched them in demonstration projects, provided even the funding for doing that. And then there was a really steep learning curve on both sides. Industry, what do the agencies actually need and want? And also the agencies, what can we actually do with space data and the services coming out of that? And this was not one shot. We did once, and then everything worked fine. We continuously doing that since the inception in, I think it was 2012 or something. So and it's really hard work to make the end users of the new applications aware of the possibilities and aware of whom to work with, whom to talk to, and which companies can provide added value to them. So this is really, really a big effort. And of course, I see there's more prestige in having your own satellite up there. And this is now country XYZ satellites orbiting the Earth and providing Earth observation data. But then you really quickly come to the point, now we have the data. Who wants it? Yeah.
Other comments on this question? Yes,
Yes,
Dr. Seth.
Yeah, it's interesting. This has come up multiple times in the last few weeks, actually, and of course in the last decades. But as I was at the group on Earth Observation Secretariat for some time, so we talked about that a lot there. But in today's context, because the technology advances so quickly in this area. So in today's context, I would just mention we were discussing this at the World Economic Forum, Global Council for Space, a lot, and they've worked, they have, I think it's exactly on data democratization, a work that's not yet published, but it's going on with the help of Deloitte and MIT Media Lab. Mm-hmm. I'm not uncomfortable at all naming the companies that are non-Japanese, but no, I'm comfortable naming anybody. Yeah, so you might want to look out for that. I think we've been talking about this in many, many arenas, including the UN and commercial also, for a long time. I think it's good that we have many, many different arenas, and also we have to keep, persistence in a way is to keep this going, and hopefully to see some results. So it was interesting. Last time we discussed this with Planet Guy, who was talking about indexing the whole planet. That's the way to go now, and for anybody to be able to access and use it. That's in the modern world what we have to be thinking, not about open source anymore. That's kind of 30 miles behind. So yeah, it's the technology advancing, so we have to keep talking about this. That's yeah, what I would think.
Thank you, Dr. Inaba. Yes. So let me move out into the audience. I think I will please back here in the corner, and then I see two other people with hands raised.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an editorial contributor on technology policy for the Hill newspaper. But in a previous incarnation, I spent about 15 years in what you might describe as the prehistoric commercial space industry with ComSat, Intelsat, Inmarsat, and more recently spent time advising companies on some of these issues. And I might quickly point out that in having helped a few companies look at flag of convenience issues, the single most important thing that a company needs in looking at a flag of convenience is stability and reliability. The worst thing that could happen would be to piss off your own country, move your flag to another country, and then find that Liberia or Panama or Bermuda has changed governments and they're no longer a convenient state. So it takes at least a decade to establish your reliability, and we'll have to just wait and see. But my question has to do with two topics that it's always seemed to me lend themselves absolutely to global governance, global approaches to dealing with them. A little bit like global climate change. You really can't do it within your alliance, opposing another alliance. They're not major topics, but I'm at a loss to figure out why there hasn't been a globalized approach to, first, planetary defense, and second, intelligent extraterrestrial life. These are both, it's hard to imagine an alliance approach to either of these. It's either going to be global or utterly ineffective. So does anybody have a comment on why we've never seen the evolution or emergence of global approaches to either of these topics? Thank you.
So I can start on the first one. This is back to when I was at NASA. So there is a global effort related to planetary defense. And there are regular conferences. The most recent one, I believe, was in Italy last year, or early this year, in Frascati, where they run even tabletop exercises among different agencies in different countries, where they see, they demonstrate that because our capabilities aren't super precise to identify all objects of a medium size. We've mapped objects that are what we call civilization ending size, but not the city ending size. They run exercises especially around those objects of that class, and they run simulations where they're like, it's a month out, it's 2 months out, this is what we know about the object, this is the corridor where we think it's going to impact, usually involving multiple countries, so that then the people in the room can talk about, okay, Japan, what information do you need? Germany, and then sharing of assets. And so there are, through the United Nations, there's a few mechanisms where countries are supposed to share alerts. And so if Germany learns of something, then can share it with the international community so that other countries can then turn their assets to observe those items and determine if there's an impact threat. So I would say in planetary defense, I think there's interest in developing always more technologies and completing the mapping exercise to make sure that we don't have threats from smaller or medium-sized objects for sure. But I would say that the international coordination is happening, and it includes countries that would be considered adversaries. Yes. So on that topic, I don't have much to say about the other one, but on that one, I think there is room for improvement, but there's a lot of good going on.
Other comments?
Well, there could be an element. Oh, sorry.
Let's go to
Yes.
Dr. Raja.
No, go ahead.
And then we'll go to Dr. Onada. Please.
Okay, so no, I would generally give a slightly broader kind of a comment on why there is no global alliance kind of an approach in a sense. And I think that has a lot to do with the current state of balance of power politics, and I think that's the driving factor as to why the world is so divided, when the global community is so divided when it comes to approaching any issue, even on the civilian side of things or even space sustainability questions. There is so much of division between states, and I think that's a function of the balance of power politics in that sense. I don't know how quickly we will get around to kind of building a sort of a common shared approach, sort of a global alliance, sort of an approach to tackling many of these issues that we are talking about, whether it is counter space or sustainable issues, sustainability or safe lunar operations, so on and so forth. Developing a common approach, commonly understood approach, a sort of an alliance approach, I'm not sure at this point of time. And I think that is one reason why, one is, of course, you have the two schools of thought between legal and politically binding stuff and so on and so forth. But you also have the possibilities of a lot of the middle space powers coming together to develop some sort of a consensus in smaller groups and then take it to larger gatherings and so on and so forth. That might be one practical way of making some progress in the immediate sort of a time frame. Again, for that, you require technology, because you need technology-aided possible evidence-based solutions you're looking at, for which, again, data is critical in that regard again. So you need a lot of technologically capable countries as well as a financially sort of capable countries in this regard to come together, to pool their efforts, to pool their resources, efforts and all of that, because I think finding a global alliance at this point of time may be not a feasible one. So at least making some progress, given that the challenges are growing, we need to make some progress, and that might be through a sort of a middle space power coalition, may be one way to look at in the immediate time frame.
Dr. Onada, did you have?
Oh, I was just going to add that there might be an element of priorities, different priorities amongst countries, like a country like Japan. Although we do join in the international discussions, of course, and we try to contribute what we can. On the other hand, being a small country prone to natural disasters on Earth, you'd have naturally different kinds of priorities. Also, the low probability of being hit by in such a small country by a meteorite or an asteroid. Could factor into the national priorities, and I would imagine that happens to a lot of other countries. But that said, we do have international for where we talk about this, and we are part of that.
I am conscious of the fact that we have about 8 minutes left in this session before we need to break for lunch. What I'd like to suggest doing is, I believe there are 2 questions still on the floor. I'd like to suggest bundling those questions so that each of you asks your question. I will also ask 1 question from our online audience, and then the panel can decide for each of you which topic you would like to respond to.
Sure.
So I believe there's a question up here, and I think there was 1 more in the back after that. If you could identify yourself, please.
I'm Bob Manning with the Stimson Center. There are a number of major contradictions. One of them, to me, is that a lot of what's going on is being driven by the private sector and largely autonomous, although governments, in terms of international law, are accountable for what their respective private sectors do. And so I'm looking out, but before the end of this, by the end of this decade, or possibly sooner, you're going to have companies trying to mine asteroids, the moon. You're going to have U.S. and China building space stations with their respective partners on the moon. And when I look at the Outer Space Treaty, I'm curious as to what legal basis there is, because the Outer Space Treaty, as I read it, there's not much ambiguity. It's a global common. Nobody's supposed to appropriate or use anything. So if I'm a startup and the U.S. licenses me to go mine lithium on an asteroid, what is the legal basis for that? Because the Artemis Accords, in my view, most of the provisions ought to be the basis of an international global treaty in terms of how you operate in space. The one thing I don't understand, because it claims to be in accord with the Outer Space Treaty, is on what basis, but they say they can mine things and start picking out real estate on the moon and things like this. I don't understand the legal basis for it, and doesn't that sort of necessarily require some kind of global sanction? Thank you.
Before anyone responds, a quick comment here.
Defer to the second panel for that.
Okay. That's at the discretion of the people on the stage. But was there another question in the back? Okay. If not, then I will also state a question from the online, from our online listeners. And the question is from Andrew Hagopian, and it concerns which elements constitute the responsible behavior norm. We've talked about responsible behavior. We've talked about monitoring behavior. How robust do you think that is now? How can we make it more robust? How does that relate to non-weaponization? I might add to that, if we're going to imagine a future in which we do have norms with respect to behavior in space, do we need to find a way to multilateralize space situational awareness, or can we proceed somehow with a small number of countries having their own individual space situational awareness competencies? And so let me walk through the panel, and each of you will have about 1 minute. You're going to respond to either of those questions, or if there's something that you really wanted to say today that you haven't had a chance to say. Now would be the time. And Laura, please.
Okay, unrelated thoughts, but kind of reacting to a lot of what's been said. One is, I would disagree with the sense that the private sector activities are unrelated to governmental, because they result from a lot of investment that the governments have done to kind of seed those developments, including technology. So I think that's an important trend. So Elon Musk and SpaceX don't just happen. They happen because the U.S. government has invested a lot to foster that. Second, the Outer Space Treaty doesn't say what you should do in space. It just says that all the countries have access to it, peaceful use, and so you could argue that you could establish a scientific base on the moon. It's still within the realm of what's allowed in the Outer Space Treaty. I know there are certainly some gaps and some complications that hopefully the second panel will get to, but that's, I think, where the ambiguity comes from. And third, I would say to the person who asked the question online, I think responsible behavior is a broad tenet, but it's gonna then, you drill down into specific types of behavior and what constitutes being responsible within that. As we were talking earlier, I think there's closer alignment among different types of actors about what responsible behavior looks like when it comes to minimizing the creation of debris. It's less in other areas, you know, if you think about responsible behavior also related to, you know, spectrum interference and cybersecurity and those types, things like that, that might be a little less mature, but that's a comment I would leave with.
Ms. Emmett,
Yes.
final comment.
Yeah, so in the future, we will see a combination and probably like a mesh of legal instruments, political, more nature instruments, and what you might call soft law, and also contracts becoming more and more intertwined, because that seems to be the only way to go. And just to give you a beginning of the answer that will go to the next panel for your question is probably that the Artemis Accords, the OSD, the Outer Space Treaty, is no doubt a legal treaty instrument. Artemis Accords is a political declaration, and that countries that sign up at the moment felt. So there it's not equal, although we try to be under and be following the Outer Space Treaty. So there is a bit more specification in that, in what the Artemis Accord says, and more practicality in that, because we know what we actually will be doing in the next decade or so, and we know the problems. So that's probably where the Artemis Accords poses questions to countries. What do you think about these that are not very clear in the Outer Space Treaty? And this is what we think. Do you want to sign up? Do you want to defer? That's what the Artemis Accords asks you. That's my view.
Mark. Yeah, maybe also for the sake of time, just picking one example, also coming back a bit to the question, for the question on responsible behavior, coming back to the question, public or government actors and private actors. So not that I will present a solution, but just another facet of what's going on when we look at space traffic management, for example. We had in the past, we had this situation that we had a privately owned satellite, Starlink, SpaceX satellite, and a European Space Agency satellite. And so the space traffic management, it's not like, it's just probabilities that there might be a collusion. It's not 100% certainty, and it's not like that's going to happen exactly at that point in time, but there are probabilities. And in the end, if you look at the commercial actor, it's a commercial decision. Will I move my satellite out of their trajectory and reduce their lifetime and accept financial loss as a final consequence? And it's up to the satellite operators. And ESA was of the opinion the risk is too high. SpaceX was of the opinion the risk is not too high. It's like in the movies, the two guys running head to head with their cars, and who's the chicken? So ESA was the chicken at that time, because their satellite obviously was much more expensive also than one of the Starlink satellites. So there are so many questions of responsible behavior we still have to tackle, and that can't be, to my opinion, not just left on the basis of a commercial decision. Is it too expensive for me to move my satellite, or that there must be other ways also to work between governments or public entities and commercial entities in that respect, for example. So many open questions that we have to tackle.
Thank you. Dr. Rajagopalan, you have the final brief comment.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. And on the first question about the whole are private actors engaging in activities and what's the legal basis for it? Like Laura said, there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of how the various the OST is being stretched or interpreted in different ways. So the point that I would make is that there are sort of a breaking of some certain norms that are being increasingly done, and that's a slippery slope. Slippery slope for two different reasons. One, If one country follows a particular set of actions, then others are going to follow. The others find it justifiable to do so, and that's one way, one issue that comes out of it. Second issue, because then it is going to be that much harder to bring back to adhering to that particular norm that prevailed for a while. And that ties me to the next that question about the whole responsible behavior in space, and how do you define what are the kind of responsible behavior. Again, that's an important aspect, and that was precisely the last OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group, was focused on developing certain practical practical norms of responsible behavior. Again, but states do caught up in what does it mean to say responsible behavior, that states can actually interpret, certain actors can interpret norms of responsible behavior in a subjective manner. That's been a fear for a number of countries in the developing world. But I think when you actually look at it, norms of responsible behavior, it's not, they are not complicated. They are very commonsensical. And I've said this in other conference as well, very commonsensical issue. Not to throw garbage in my neighbor's yard. I think that's a very, very practical sense of good behavior to follow. That is essentially, you don't create engage in an activity that would result in huge amount of space debris creation. That's a norm that is practical, that is pragmatic, something commonsensical. A second, not to interfere in my neighbor's TV antenna, not to engage in, again, cyber sort of a warfare in outer space or electronic warfare in space. These are the kind of things. So this is nothing, when you usually say norms of responsible behavior, everybody would believe that these are Western concepts that are being thrown at a lot of the global South or developing countries. We don't know what it is, and we don't know. These can be subjectively interpreted. But these are commonsensical things that we need to popularize, that we need to socialize a lot more, so that I think increasingly in today's context, the kind of activities that states engage in, we need to spell out each of these commonsensical behavior that is expected as a good responsible stakeholder in a sense. So that's where I went. Multilateralizing SSA, I think that's a great great idea, because I think this is something that is so required if we have to be able to use space in a sustainable fashion for the future. And I think SSA is a relatively non-controversial area that can actually foster greater cooperation. The US has the largest network of sensors, radars, but at the same time, there are certain gaps in the coverage, especially of the of the Southern Hemisphere. So partnering with other countries, especially in the Asian context, whether it is India, Japan, China, and other countries in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, I think that can be very, very useful. But multilateralizing and going beyond these countries is also an important aspect that we need to look into and work towards. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We are now going to break for a half hour before the afternoon panel on the new regulatory regime. Please join me in thanking the entire panel.